My boyfriend dumped me to steal my house, so I let him think he won until I changed the locks. 6 years ago, I met a man named Clayton Money, and for a while, I genuinely believed I had found someone special. Not just someone to love, but someone to build a life with. Clayton was sharp-witted, charming in an unpolished way, and always speaking about the future like he could already see it mapped out in his mind. He had plans, big ones, and he told them to me with a certainty that felt contagious. He wanted to start a media business, maybe run a podcast, maybe a YouTube channel. Something that would, in his words, let him speak to people and change the narrative. I admired that about him. I was always the cautious one. I kept a secure job as a billing specialist at a local clinic, paid my taxes early, and avoided risks whenever possible. Clayton, in contrast, made me feel like maybe taking a leap wasn't so bad. Maybe you didn't need a 5-year plan to make life work. In the early months, he was exciting. Inspiring, even. He read self-help books, drafted outlines for projects, and stayed up late learning video editing. I thought, this could be the beginning of something. I pictured us as a team, me with the practical knowledge, him with the creative spark. But that version of Clayton didn't last long. After our first year together, I started to notice a pattern. Every new project came with a flurry of excitement, followed by delays, then excuses, and eventually silence. He moved on from one idea to another with startling speed, leaving behind half-finished recordings, dusty ring lights, and domain names he never renewed. Then came the cryptocurrency phase. He threw himself into it like it was his life's calling, speaking in jargon I couldn't follow and spending long hours on forums and live streams. He called it building his portfolio, but all I saw were erratic investments and online friends who vanished when the market dipped. When everything crashed, he insisted it was temporary. It wasn't. Then it was day trading. Then collectibles. Then a plan to flip vintage tools online. He went from idea to idea like a wind-up toy, confident the next one would be the one. And through all of it, I was the one paying the bills, keeping our lives together while he convinced himself he was moments away from success. I didn't complain, not out loud. I told myself that supporting someone meant standing by them during setbacks. That believing in him was part of love. That I could absorb the financial strain for now because surely, eventually, his ambition would pay off. But over time, my belief started to wear thin. He didn't just fail, he expected to be caught when he fell. He never worked part-time jobs to offset our expenses, never once considered contributing in ways that weren't tied to some larger vision. Our apartment, my apartment, inherited from my late aunt, was something he spoke about like it belonged to both of us. Not maliciously at first, but casually. As though living there, rent-free, had earned him ownership. Still, I gave him time. I made excuses. He's just trying to figure himself out. He's under pressure. He needs space to grow. But after 5 years of growing only sideways, I started asking myself questions I had been avoiding. Did he ever really plan to contribute? Did he see me as a partner? Or just as a support system? I kept brushing those thoughts aside until one day, he stopped making it easy to ignore them. It started with small things. Criticisms about how I folded the laundry. How I left dishes to soak in the sink. Harmless, I thought. Maybe even signs that he wanted to help keep the space tidier. But then came the comments about the apartment itself. About how it wasn't being taken care of. How the guest room, my aunt's old office, wasn't being used efficiently. He even mentioned repainting the living room to bring in better light for his projects. I remember blinking at him. Thinking, your projects? Your redesign? It didn't feel like sharing anymore. It felt like claiming. One Tuesday, I came home after a 12-hour shift to find him sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded, face unusually serious. He asked if we could talk. I thought maybe he'd gotten a job offer or wanted to apologize for the way he'd been speaking to me. Instead, he said, I think we should separate. Just like that. I stared at him. Are you serious? He nodded. My first instinct was disbelief. Not because breakups are uncommon, but because I had held him up through everything. I had believed in him when no one else would. Paid his way, encouraged him, helped him pitch ideas. And now, after 6 years, he was ending things like it was just a business decision. When I didn't answer right away, he added, I think it'll be healthy for both of us. A reset. A reset. As if our years together were a miscalibrated program. Then, with astonishing calm, he said, you can go stay with your cousin or something while I get things sorted here. It took me a moment to understand what he meant. He thought he was keeping the apartment. My apartment. My name on the deed. My monthly bills, my repairs, my home. I didn't respond. I stood up, went to the bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. I had a folder in the drawer beside me. Inside was the deed. Utility bills. Repair receipts. All with my name, all paid from my account. I stared at them for a long time. And then I decided. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to argue or convince him of reality. I was going to let him keep believing. Let him get comfortable. Let him think the reset was his idea and that he had one. For the next few days, I played the role he had quietly assigned me. I didn't argue when he brought up next steps. I didn't challenge his offhand remarks about starting fresh. I didn't even correct him when he floated the idea of converting the guest room, my late aunt's workspace, into a dedicated studio now that I was moving out. I just listened. Watched. Waited. There's a specific kind of silence that comes when you know the truth but choose to keep it to yourself. At first, it's uncomfortable. Then, strangely, it becomes empowering. It was the first time in our entire relationship that I held all the cards, and he didn't even realize he was playing a game. Clayton walked around the apartment like a man rehearsing for a real estate open house. He rearranged furniture, moved my framed photos into drawers, and brought in a rug that clashed with everything in the living room. Gives the space more personality, he said, standing back with his arms folded. Yours, I assume? I asked. He blinked, not quite catching the tone. Yeah. Feels like me. That was the whole point, wasn't it? He wanted to rewrite the story. Shift the setting from our home to his. He wasn't just ending a relationship, he was rewriting history. I started keeping notes. Every little thing he moved. Every comment about how this place could finally be what it was meant to be. I watched him walk into rooms and linger, as if visualizing a life that never existed. I watched him smile to himself like a man who believed he had inherited something he built. But he hadn't built anything. He had only occupied. And now he thought the space belonged to him. He started bringing up logistics. You should probably give your cousin a heads up, he said one morning while sipping coffee I had paid for. Don't want to spring it on them too suddenly. I nodded. Of course. I'll handle it. He smiled. A warm, satisfied smile. The kind people give when they believe they've taken care of something difficult. The way he smiled when he believed he had taken care of me. I began setting my own plans in motion. I reached out to a locksmith I trusted, someone who had changed the locks once years ago, after a break-in down the block. I explained I needed the job done quietly. The appointment was made. No questions asked. In the meantime, Clayton grew bolder. He began referring to the apartment as his space in front of friends. I overheard a phone call with an old college buddy where he said, "Yeah, I'm finally living solo." Needed the mental space. Can't build anything when you're tied down to someone who doesn't understand the vision. I didn't react. I just wrote it down. Each lie. Each twist of the truth. I was cataloging his version of reality. The night before the locksmith was scheduled to come, Clayton had someone over. Her name was Brielle. She was soft-spoken, wore a camel-colored coat, and smiled at me politely when I passed by on my way to the kitchen. "Oh, hey," she said. I didn't know there was a roommate situation. I looked at Clayton. He looked back, a bit too quickly, and said, "Oh, no, this is just temporary. She's getting things sorted. Probably moving out soon." I nodded. "Sooner than you think." He didn't catch it. He was too busy pouring wine and showing Brielle the apartment as if he had personally designed it. "This piece," he said, gesturing to the mid-century bookshelf that had once belonged to my grandmother, "was one of the first things I brought in. It really anchored the space." I almost laughed. The gall of it. The complete, confident falsehood. He had never once dusted that shelf, let alone picked it out. But he had claimed it, and that was enough, in his mind, to make it his. I stayed in my room that evening. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't want to ruin the illusion just yet. I wanted him to think he had succeeded. That he had already won. The next morning, he slept in. I got up early. Cleaned the kitchen. Opened the windows. Let the cold air in. The locksmith arrived right on time. It took less than 30 minutes. Front door. Balcony access. Back exit. New keys. New control. No drama. By the time Clayton wandered into the living room in his sweatpants, yawning and stretching, the locks had already been changed, and the new keys were sitting in my coat pocket. Hey, he mumbled. You headed out? I nodded. Just finishing something up. He didn't even ask what. He made himself breakfast with my groceries, and I sat at the dining table, watching him move around the kitchen that, within a matter of hours, he'd no longer have access to. It was surreal. He still thought he had control. That he was directing how this story would end. And I was letting him believe it, right up until the final scene. That evening, I made dinner for myself, washed the dishes, and calmly sat him down. Clayton, I said, I need you to pack your things. He blinked. What? You're leaving tomorrow, I said. The locks have been changed. I already spoke to building management. If you're still here by noon, they'll be notified. His expression flickered from confusion to amusement. You're joking. No. I'm not. He stood up, arms crossed, trying to muster the kind of authority he usually used when talking to customer service reps. You can't just kick me out. I live here. No, I said. You stayed here. You didn't live here. Not legally. Not financially. Not practically. You stayed. And now, he was going. For a few seconds, Clayton just stood there. I could see it happening, the process of denial, then confusion, then panic playing across his face like clockwork. The same cycle I had watched after every failed business venture, every time reality didn't bend to his expectations. But, we talked about this, he said, voice pitching slightly. You said you were leaving. No, I said. You assumed I was leaving. I never agreed to anything. He blinked, trying to steady himself. You can't just decide I have to go. I live here. I'd been here for years. I reached into the drawer beside me and pulled out a folder, documents I had quietly compiled over the past few days. Deed to the apartment. Utility bills. Property tax records. All in my name. I laid them out on the table, each one like a nail in the coffin of his narrative. You've never paid rent, Clayton. You've never contributed to the mortgage, or the taxes, or even the repairs when the bathroom flooded last year. This place has been mine since the day I inherited it. You were a guest. His mouth opened, then closed. I could almost see him flipping through mental flashcards, trying to find some argument that might stick. That's not fair, he said finally, his voice quieter. I've been part of this life. I've built things here. You didn't build anything, I said, calm and steady. You occupied. There's a difference. He stood there for a long time, silent. And then, in a tone that made me pause, he asked, Is this really about the apartment? I almost laughed. Because to him, this wasn't about the apartment. It couldn't be. That would make him look small, petty, ungrateful. No, he needed it to be about something deeper. A betrayal, maybe. A loss of trust. Something he could mourn and romanticize. But it wasn't. This is about me finally seeing things clearly, I said. About how long I'd been making excuses for you, hoping you'd catch up to the responsibilities you said you wanted. He looked down, then muttered, You never believed in me. And there it was. The fallback. Not an apology. Not ownership. Blame. I didn't rise to it. I didn't need to. Instead, I said, You have until noon tomorrow to collect your things. After that, the building supervisor will treat you as a trespasser. That's when the anger came. The arguments. The guilt-tripping. He said I had led him on. That I was using him for company, that I'd planned this for weeks. When none of that worked, he shifted again to desperation. Where am I supposed to go, he asked, his voice breaking just enough to seem sincere. I'm not responsible for that, I replied. He stared at me, searching for a trace of softness. A flicker of doubt. Something he could use. But there was nothing left. I had done the emotional labor long enough. This wasn't cruelty, it was closure. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in months. The apartment felt different. Not quieter, lighter. As if a weight had been lifted from the walls themselves. In the morning, I watched him pack. He was slower than necessary, stopping to look at everything he touched like it might suddenly disappear. He asked a few final questions. Asked if I was sure. If I might reconsider. If we could talk again in a few weeks. I told him no. And then he was gone. Just like that. He left behind a few things: an old jacket, a broken tripod, a tangle of cords in a plastic bin. But more than anything, he left behind the space I had built, free at last of the quiet erosion he brought with him. I expected that to be the end of it. But Clayton wasn't someone who left quietly. Not when there was still a story to rewrite. For the first few days after Clayton left, the apartment felt unusually still. Not empty, just uncluttered. There was no humming from equipment he never used, no piles of unopened packages claiming to be investment materials. Just the rhythm of a life I had kept on track while waiting for someone else to catch up. And for a while, that stillness was enough. I poured myself back into work. Reconnected with people I had slowly lost touch with. Rearranged furniture. Deleted files I'd once edited for him. Reclaimed every inch of the space that had once been shared in name only. But then the calls started. At first, it was people I hadn't heard from in ages, mutual acquaintances, former co-workers of his, an old friend from a design class he never finished. Each conversation began the same way. "Hey, just checking in. I heard things ended with you and Clayton. He mentioned you were going through something? Or he said you'd pushed him out. That he gave everything and you just shut down." I recognized the phrasing. I had heard Clayton say things like that before when past friends backed away from him. When old projects failed and he needed someone to blame. He wasn't done with the story. He was just rewriting it without me in it. I didn't react. Not at first. I told them we had grown apart. That it was for the best. That he'd moved on, and so had I. But the messages kept coming. Each version of the story just slightly different. In one version, I had become cold and distant after he started succeeding. In another, I had taken advantage of his trust. In the most dramatic retelling, I had manipulated the apartment paperwork so that he lost everything overnight. He'd turned himself into a cautionary tale. A martyr of ambition. What he hadn't counted on, though, was that I had proof. Receipts. Bills. Lease documentation. Screenshots of our shared calendar where I paid for every grocery run, every Wi-Fi bill, every equipment rental for projects that never happened. At first, I considered calling him. Confronting him. But I knew it wouldn't matter. Clayton didn't change the narrative because he believed it. He changed it because he needed it to sound true to someone. Anyone. He needed sympathy. Validation. A reason why his story wasn't about failure, but betrayal. So instead of calling him, I sent one single email. I attached all the records. No commentary. No accusations. Just facts. I blind copied every person who had reached out to me that week. And then I left it alone. I never heard back. But the calls stopped. The messages slowed, then disappeared entirely. The silence returned, not the uneasy kind I once feared, but the peace of something finished. Still, the story didn't quite end there. About a month later, I ran into a woman I didn't recognize at the grocery store. She was standing in the frozen aisle, staring at a list on her phone. When our eyes met, she smiled awkwardly. "Are you Madeline?" she asked. I hesitated. "Yes? I'm Francis," she said. "Clayton mentioned you. I dated him for a bit. Briefly." I felt my breath catch, not out of hurt, but curiosity. Francis looked kind. Grounded. Too perceptive to have been fooled for long. She didn't say much. Just that she'd heard the story. That she'd asked questions. And that it hadn't taken her long to realize it didn't add up. "He talked like he'd been wronged," she said. "But every time I asked for details, it got vague. Convenient." She shook her head gently. "Anyway. I just wanted to say you're not crazy. Or cold. Or anything he made you out to be." I thanked her. Wished her well. Watched her walk away. And that night, I sat in the living room, the one he once tried to claim, and took a breath. I thought about the woman I had been when I met him. Hopeful. Careful. Trying to believe that patience could replace stability, that faith in someone's ambition could be enough. And then I thought about the woman I had become. Measured. Quietly strong. Capable of letting someone walk away not because I stopped caring, but because I had finally started caring for myself. Clayton was gone. His stories, too. And for the first time in years, I didn't need to rewrite anything. Because the truth stood on its own. Thank you all for watching the video, and see you soon.